a very effusive welcome, so thank you very much. I suppose the starting point, of course, is that all of us must be I hope all of us in this room celebrate the fact that Boris Johnson is going to go finally. Finally, all it feels like all of the corruption, all of the lies, all of the parties have all caught up with him finally, and he's finally going to go. And that's a good thing. And he can't go soon enough, and I hope he doesn't make it to the autumn as he wants to, and he's forced out much quicker. And I think, whilst having said that, now I'm not celebrating that, I think I want to talk through really what that means. I think the first thing I want to say, though, is it's a great shame that Boris Johnson is going on the basis of a bunch of billionaires who are trying to save their own skins, protect their own careers, and hopefully put themselves in charge of the Tory party. It's a shame that they forced him out, and he hasn't been forced out by a massive rebellion from below of angry working class people, trade unionists, working people who are sick to death of the Tories and what they stand for. And I think you can see this partly reflected in the complete uselessness of the official Labour Party opposition in Parliament over this period. But nonetheless, he is going to go. And I think part of the reason he's going to go is because all the contradictions that are taking place in British society have sort of come to the fore. It's not just about what Boris Johnson may or may not have done. It's not just about this odious character Pincher. It's not just about the parties and so on. It's the fact that he's sitting atop a sort of powder keg of inequality, of corruption, of economic crisis, and all the other stuff that's going on. Having said that, I think we do have to talk a little bit about the leadership election, because it does matter who's the Prime Minister, and to a certain extent it does matter which one of the 8 candidates that are still in the Tory party leadership selection in the first round comes to power. What I think the leadership election is, first of all, and I think millions of people see this, certainly the people at work are talking about it in these contexts, is it's a real insight into how a tiny minority of people live in this world. It's an insight into the sort of sordid wealth of the rich and of the Tory party and of a section of MPs. And also it's an insight into how they actually feel. You get a real sense of how they feel about wealth, about power, how they think about ordinary people, their sexism, their misogyny, their racism, their scapegoating that comes through in their comments to the press, and, in their statements and their priorities and their politics and so on. So let's have a look at a few of them. Up until earlier today, when there was a poll that said he would come second and that Penny Mordaunt would be the winner, I'd have put money on Rishi Sunak being the next leader. Perhaps that's likely. Rishi Sunak exemplifies what you might call a sort of rich link, the link between the wealthy ruling class and the Tory party in Parliament. His slogan is "Ready for Rishi." I don't know how many people here are ready for Rishi, but him and his wife, who is the daughter of a multi-billionaire Indian businessman, have a joint personal fortune of £730 million, slightly under £750 million. It's worth bearing that in mind when you hear him talk, when you hear him put his policies through and so on. He's the richest MP in the House of Commons. He was known as being the low-tax chancellor, of course low tax particularly for his wife who didn't pay it, but really he kind of exemplifies that section of the Tory party that pushes the idea of a smaller state, low tax and so on. And if you've seen the front page of the Daily Telegraph today, you'll know that his slogan is to run the economy like Margaret Thatcher did. Now, what that really means is class war. That means defending a sort of neoliberal privatised agenda, standing up to the trade unions. He's made explicit, they've all made explicitly, that if they were Prime Minister, the RMT would be able to strike and so on. But really, it's a statement of intent, a statement that if he wins, he's got a particular type of hardline, right-wing, pro-privatisation, anti-trade union Prime Minister. Having said that, I think pretty much all of them are going to be like that to a certain extent. Jeremy Hunt is the next one on the list I was going to bother talking about. As Health Secretary, he was responsible for the policies that made it no longer possible for foreign nationals to get free healthcare in the NHS. He was the health secretary when the junior doctors were forced to go on strike, and I many people in this room went to picket lines and protests over that. He's seen sometimes as being a bit of a liberal lefty, and for the Tory party he isn't in any ways at all. He's quite happy to use sort of dog whistle racism when it comes to, we have to be whiter than white ourselves, he said when asked about racism in the Tory party. He's not as rich as Rishi Sunak. He's only a multi-millionaire. He studied at the private Charterhouse School with 150k a year fees. So again, and sort of representing that sort of upper class, born into money, right-wing Tory Prime Minister. I should say, Jeremy Hunt also wants to be a low-tax Prime Minister and wants to cut corporation tax to 15% tax on the profits of big business. And it's interesting because you'll remember that a number of these politicians were in the Tory cabinet that was finally forced to declare that they'd have a windfall tax on the wealthy oil companies and the profits of gas and oil companies and so on. But really they want to allow those companies to recoup that. So he wants to cut corporation tax to 15%, as does Liz Truss. Liz Truss is a third on my list. A woman who was a trade and industry secretary, and famously, when asked if she'd ever stood up to anyone in the Middle East over human rights issues, couldn't remember a single occasion when she challenged anyone from the Middle Eastern government over human rights issues. And she was the one who, when the High Court banned arms sales to Saudi Arabia because they breached human rights guidelines, she restarted them. So you get a kind of a sense of who she is. She also wants to scrap the Human Rights Act. And you could go on and on and on. Penny Mordaunt was the Minister for Fire. I didn't even know there was a Cabinet Minister for Fire Services, but she was the fire during the last firefighter strike, and was absolutely intransient about helping the firefighters over the pension claims. And so on. And you could go on and on and on. They're all wealthy, they're all pro-rich, they're all pro-business, they're all into scapegoating, they're all into racism. All of them support the Rwanda plan, which it's great that it was put on hold by the High Court until after the election. But there's no doubt that whichever Tory Prime Minister, Tory MP becomes Prime Minister, they'll try and restate it or something else, because what they're doing with their policies is they're jockeying for sections of the vote of one of perhaps the most right-wing electorates in you could possibly have, the membership of the Tory party. Tory MPs will have a big say, so will the Tory membership. And famously, during the last leadership candidate election by the Tory party, at least 40% of the Tory party membership wanted Nigel Farage to be their leader, even though he wasn't in the Tory party itself. So they're pitching to the right, they're pitching to a racist, misogynist voter base that wants to see lower taxes, doesn't like trade unions, doesn't like a large state, is more worried about immigration over the channel than it is about the NHS or public services or anything else like that. So that's the context of the election. And I personally don't think, we have a dog in this race in the sense that we don't really care which one of these multi-millionaire bastards comes to be in charge of a party made up of some of the worst scoundrels that we know. But I really want to spend more now time talking a little bit about the crisis that has led this to happen, because it is quite common to just see this as an election that has come because Boris Johnson's lies have finally caught up with him. That he's been dogged by scandal and corruption for so long that he wasn't able to keep a lid on it, and finally they rebelled against him. And I don't think that's enough to explain it. I think that matters. I think if Boris Johnson had kept his nose clean, if he'd gone to less parties and the rest of it, we probably wouldn't be having a leadership election. But actually what I think that is happening in British society is a whole number of contradictions and crises that are starting to work themselves through, principally an economic crisis, but also other issues and problems in society. COVID, on top of the Brexit and other economic problems, have led to a cost of living crisis which the Tories clearly have no strategy at all for dealing with, and are certainly not going to deal with it by allowing working people to have an above inflation pay rise. They've made it clear, for instance, that almost no public sector workers will get a pay rise above inflation this year in a context of something like a quarter of the population struggling to pay bills on a weekly basis. It's not an economic crisis that's simply restricted to Britain, though. That's we're very much at the front of it, and we're very much experiencing it worse than most of Europe. But what also is happening in Britain, I think, is a growing discontent with the way that the cost of living crisis is combined with massive profits for big business and for the very, very, very rich. At the same time, I think the legacy of the COVID pandemic is also there in the backseat, causing ideological and economic problems for the government. Boris Johnson did oversee the figures today from the Office of National Statistics, saying that 200,000 people have now been recorded as dying from COVID, and Boris Johnson, in fact all of the people I've mentioned, have been party and parcel of that. And what they tried to do through COVID is to offset the impact on the economy by pouring money into the economy and not raising taxes, but not particularly lowering them, but essentially printing money. And that means that they've sort of bottled up an economic crisis that is starting to unfold. Then you throw into the mix the Ukraine war, the shortages, the problems, and the political crisis that's around that, and you really have a bit of a time bomb for the British population. And I think in that context, what they've tried to do is twofold. Firstly, they've tried to push the blame onto us. Inflation is caused by this wage price spiral, which is, of course, unbelievable because none of us had a wage price, a pay rise, so we can't be causing inflation. At the same time as sort of pushing blame elsewhere, it's the Ukraine war, or it's Brexit, or it's this thing there, rather than seeing it as a sort of problem that arises, or a crisis that arises out of the nature of modern capitalism. And the problem with this is that there's no one really pushing any sort of real alternative. As I said at the start, if in Parliament there was a whole section of MPs who were constantly putting pressure on the Tories, on Johnson, on all the other ones, saying, look, this is your problem, you represent a class that's got wealthy, while the rest of us have suffered through COVID, you represent the class that's got wealthy, while the rest of us have been denied a wage rise, and so on. I think would be shifting the debate. But really, there isn't that in Parliament, there isn't that really elsewhere, except in a few cases where strikes are starting to push back. And I think, perhaps I'm overemphasising this, but I genuinely do believe that the thing that may have shifted the ground in terms of the Tory leadership election is that between the vote of confidence that Boris Johnson won at the start of June and Rishi Sunak and the others moving against him at the end of the months, with the fact that there were 120,000 days of strike action by rail workers. And I think this is important because it was a new factor, it was, if you like, a new issue inside all the complex other issues. And of course the Tories hate strikes, they certainly don't want rail workers to win. But I think the scale of that strike, it's how solid it was, and the way, how popular it was amongst working people will have frightened them. And then it was followed, of course, by big votes from other sectors of workers, other rail workers, postal workers, and so on. And the Tories clearly know that they are, I think someone said it at our meeting last week, they're sometimes better class warriors than the left. They understand the dynamics much better, and they know that the cost of living crisis is going to lead potentially to very big rumblings of discontent and strike action in the autumn, with lots of sort of public sector workers in particular starting to demand real change. So they know that there's a powder keg, and they perhaps felt that getting rid of Boris Johnson was part of a way of undermining that and pushing the trade unions back, and leaving him as a bit of a scapegoat for the crisis. I think the other thing is that there is a fear from the Tories about the deep-seated crisis of British capitalism breaking through and shattering much wider things. There was a number of it was quite interesting that a week ago, a whole number of Tory MPs met Johnson to urge him not to resign, because they feared that if he resigned there would be a general election which would be followed by a Labour SNP coalition that would lead to Scottish independence and the breakup of the British state. And so they're also aware of these much wider problems and very, very worried about where it goes. So who will be the next Tory leader? In some senses it doesn't matter, but what does matter is how they come to be elected and selected, and in the context of that. If they come to power and on the back of big strikes, big protests, big demonstrations demanding real action and so on, it will be one thing. It will mean that they come into the new Prime Minister will be elected, will be chosen, and it will be on the back of discontent and anger. If they come and get anointed as the new Prime Minister, and everyone else is pretty much looking on passively as bystanders, then they will be much more confident about whether or not they can continue attacks on the working class and continue scapegoating immigrants and refugees, attacking trans rights and all the rest of it. And so I think that what the left has to be articulating in an argument is a strategy at the moment that says we cannot sit back in this context. We have to be fighting over all of these political issues. We have to be demanding and supporting strikes, and we have to be fighting against the cost of living crisis and trying to force the rich and the Tory party onto the back foot. And I think I want to finish with two more general points linked to this. Is that actually I think the mood is there a little bit. I think around the world we're starting to see the growth of movements that are saying we cannot continue living like this anymore. The cost of living crisis, inflation, shortages and so on. People, I'm sure, and hopefully people will mention it, will have seen the Sri Lankan protests last week that ousted the president. Quite incredible mass movements on the streets that actually are linked to issues very, very similar to the ones that many working people in Britain are very, very, very worried about. This other thing I think is that unless we start to build movements on this sort of scale that can force back the ruling class, actually the prospects are quite scary for the growth of other forces. The shift to the right in the sort of Tory rhetoric is going to open the door and give confidence to even further people even further to the right. And we have to look over the channel of France, where the fascists got 41% of votes in the most recent election, to recognise the real threat. The final thing, though, is I think we have to be saying as socialists that what the Tory election shows is how shallow their democracy is and how little they care for what ordinary people think. The fact that the election rules inside the Tories were made up on Monday night, essentially, for the very first time, demonstrates that they don't really care about this stuff. They can change it whenever they want to. The fact that such a tiny number of people get to say who the next Prime Minister of Britain is also a real indictment of our political system. And that these people, they are pitching to the right, and they're making they're calling for their policies which are about benefiting the rich and the wealthy and big business. They've got no solutions to the big political issues that are underlying all the problems: the crisis of war, the crisis of ecology, the crisis of the economy. And so I think for us as socialists, it's another excuse and another reason, if you like, to talk about how we could organise society differently. How, if we want to have a world without poverty, without inflation, without economic crisis, without racism, ecological disaster and so on, we need to go beyond fighting simply about who's going to be the next Prime Minister or who's going to be an MP of which area or the rest of it, and start arguing for a world based on people's needs, not on the greed of a tiny number of individuals. And so the Tory party election, I suppose, in summary, it's one that exposes all the inequalities and iniquities of British society and capitalist society in general. And actually, we want to reject all of that and fight for a better world. And that means not being bystanders, but trying to argue for people to take to the streets and to the picket line to transform the political agenda of the world.